Good morning, everyone. I'm Katie Hall, Transport Planning Sector Director from Sistra, here to host another one of our COP26 webinar sessions. We've had some really interesting discussions so far over the last few months, different topics, and today we're more focused on the future of rural mobility. There's been a lot of conversation and reports over the summer about sort of the challenges of future rural mobility, particularly the differences that we've got with urban and rural challenges. And I think we'd like to explore that in a bit more detail today with a great panel of speakers that we've got. Just a reminder that this session is being recorded and it will be distributed afterwards and available on the Landor Link YouTube channel for catch up, and the slides will also be distributed to attendees today. So look forward to getting started and kicking off with our panel of speakers on them. So first up, we've got Julian Scriven from Brompton Bike Hire. We're also joined by Mandy, Jennifer and Neil to talk about a range of different topics that affect rural mobility around planning, transport solutions and community engagement as well. So I will go straight to Julian this morning to kick us off on our first presentation. Thank you.
Good morning, everybody. And I'm really honoured to be part of this conference. It's something that's very dear to my heart. I grew up in the depths of Somerset as a child, so rural mobility is very much something which, ever since I started in the micromobility sector, has kind of been something I wanted to try and be involved in. So if we can move on to the first next slide. Thank you very much. I mean, ultimately, I think everyone sees this as the how to nail jelly to a ceiling scenario. It's how you get people out of privately owned cars in rural communities and how you get them to access shared mobility, whether it's macro mobility like buses or micro mobility like bikes or other kind of scooters even. Next slide, please. The biggest pushback that we get whenever we look at shared mobility solutions is, well, that's all very well and good for London, for Birmingham, where you have that kind of density of population, but it doesn't work in rural areas. And quite often it's used by the kind of pro-private car lobby as an exemplar about, well, we can't do it for everyone, so we shouldn't do it for anyone. And so whilst we might look at it in terms of totality of journeys being considered less important than mobility around cities, actually from a kind of national point of view, it's a critical point, because unless we can resolve it for rural communities as well as the cities, that's always going to be an inertia towards not addressing these things. Now, historically, actually, there was shared rural mobility in towns and villages and rural locations, and that was the buses. However, as we kind of look at the next couple of slides, you'll see the issue that we face there. So moving on to the next slide. The issue is we've seen a massive decline in buses in the rural areas, whether we look at it in terms of the number of passengers that are using it. Now, this data is pre-COVID-19, but I don't imagine it's improved. If anything, I imagine it's worsened considerably. And that's since 2007, there's been over a 20% decline in bus uses outside of London. You go into rural areas, it's even sharper. Moving on to the next one, you'll see that in parallel to this, there's been a substantial decline in the number of bus routes that are subsidised. And realistically, when you look at rural locations, it's very difficult to justify the kind of privatized model in them. So if we kind of look at kind of what this means on the next slide, we'll see that public transport is privatized, buses particularly, which means understandably bus operators have had to kind of cut back on the unprofitable routes, except for where they are absolutely forced to do so. This has led, of course, to less buses being available less often in rural areas, which means it's no longer a reliable transport solution for people in more rural locations. Critically, the bus used to be the kind of activator for mass transit. It was how people then got to the train centre, it's how they got train station, it's how they got into the towns. So that's almost forced rural communities to become increasingly dependent on private cars. So what's the solution? Well, if we kind of consider the obvious one for a second on the next slide, bike share, is this the time it rides to the rescue? Well, again, let's look at a bit of data around that on the next couple of slides, because this is, again, it's not a magic bullet. So if we look at the next slide, there's two ways. Again, apologies, I'm going to get my geek hat on. There are a couple of ways that you can look at how to figure out how many bikes you need to be successful in a bike share scheme. One of them is to look at per head of population. So again, these are very general figures. Please don't go away and try and build a whole bike share scheme off the back of these. But you know, if you're looking top down, you'd say if you have 500 per 500 people, you need roughly one bike. So you take somewhere like Cardiff and do the maths, you need about 1,000 bikes. And guess what? If you go and look at the Cardiff bike share scheme run by Next Bike at the moment, they're heading towards that number. So that's quite good. If you then try and do that for Carmarthenshire, for example, you'd need 400 bikes, which sounds great. But you look at the area of Carmarthenshire, you'd only have like one bike per, you know, well, you'd only have one bike per 1.16 bike per kilometre square. Sorry, getting tangled up. So there's another way you look at it. You can look at it in terms of geographical area. So if we look at that on the next slide, we see that, again, for Cardiff going the other way, guess what? You get to this nice number, 7 bikes per square kilometre. If you try to apply that to Carmarthenshire, however, you'd end up with needing 17,000 bikes. Now, when you look at the population of Carmarthenshire, you'd almost say, well, do you know what? It would probably be cheaper to go and buy everyone a cheap bike and give it to them. So clearly, whilst bike share is incredibly impactful in dense conurbations, it's not really the solution. So where does that leave us? Well, looking on that, you know, number one, ignore the problem. Tell people tough, it only works in cities. Second one is subsidizing. Now, we're in a tough financial environment at the moment. Nobody wants to talk about heavy ongoing subsidies. So I think that's a very different one. So that forces us to option 3, which is to find a different model. Now, on the next slide, I'm not so recently now, I was once accused of being the man who saw every problem as a nail because he was wielding his shared mobility bike hammer. Well, it's true. The trouble is, I've only got the hammer, although I do like to work with other, and he said other tools in the mobility sector, with the spanners and the screwdrivers and the set squares to build multimodal solutions. But today, I actually want to look at what we can achieve with that hammer in rural communities. So, moving on to the next slide. This would be the time where I try and sell loads and loads of Brompton docks, right? You know, come on, let's put a Brompton dock in every village. No, that's not the answer. And I'll tell you why it's not the answer. There is a capital cost to that, and it's not an insignificant capital cost. And whilst it's an incredibly effective way, again, in towns and cities, when you start looking at rural populations, you start looking at that capital cost against the number of people who could access it. The numbers just don't add up. We're not here to cover the UK in big metal boxes. We're here to get people accessing public transport. And the answer is getting, sorry to be crude, bums on bikes. So how do we do that in a rural community? Well, we've come up with something with Brompton. I want to share it with you just as a bit of inspiration. So if we go on to the next slide. We're going Dopplers, which sounds absolutely bonkers. And by this, I don't mean the kind of old school OFO, mobike, leaving thousands of bikes on the side of the road. No, what we're talking about is we can now create a virtual rental location. And we're actually doing this right now. And that could be in a community hub. It can be a village, it could be a pub. I love the idea of a pub. It could be a community centre. It could be a post office. It could be the local corner shop. The whole point is people are able, just like they do with our existing docks at the moment, book the bike in advance, pick the bike up. And because they can book in advance, they can book it. You know, let's use the example of a pub. Now, pub, I don't know what time pubs open in villages. Back in the day when I used to live there, it used to be 10 o'clock. But, you know, that might not be ideal. But because it's bookable in advance and because it's hire rather than share, they can pick it up the night before, perhaps have a cheeky pint, then pick up their bike, take it home. Now, of course, it's going to have to be electric. And actually, we believe it has to be folding. And the reason why we believe it has to be folding in electric is it then allows them to be interactive with other modes of transport. So if you can visualize this, they pick up their bike from the community hub. They cycle on an electric bike because of topography and because of distance to a modal hub. Now, this might be the next town along. It might be a bus stop that has more frequent trips. It might be to a train station. Once they get there, they can then take it on the mode of transport with them, take it to the town, city, their end destination, use it there, and then reverse the journey. Moving on to the next slide. We've already got this working. We're trialing it right now. We've got it, admittedly, not in rural locations yet, but we've actually got it working in a car hire location. We've got it going in bike stores. We've got it going in hotels. We've even got it going in a community centre, albeit in a town. Now, the reason why we think it's working quite well is because actually what we've done is effectively created a hire solution that has no admin and hassle for the partner. In practice, what it means is all they need to be doing is, this may sound a bit Rise of the Machines from Terminator, but we're replacing the machines with people. So instead of it being an automated dock that people go along to, they go along to John or Gladys at the pub or at the local shop and pick up the bike. But you know, John and Gladys aren't repairing bikes, they aren't managing reservations, they're literally just handing bikes over. Crucially as well, it's underwritten with all the insurances that need to come along with it. So unlike kind of typical community hire schemes, they don't have to kind of sort all that out in advance. Just to summarize the kind of where we are with that on the next slide. We need to find a way of activating transport, a multimodal transport in rural areas. And let's be very, very clear. We can't expect everyone to jump on a bike. That's just ridiculous. It's totally bonkers. It's not viable. It's not suitable. Look at people with different physical needs, etc. However, what we can do is make available a solution that allows people to then access other modes of transport and hopefully encourage people who have got the ability to ride a bike, who would consider using an e-bike, to use it. The more people we can transition onto different modes of transport, the more we reduce the congestion, with the less journeys we have going in from rural areas into cities. And crucially for me, and this may sound a bit kind of Yabu sucks, what it does is it gives us a shared mobility solution that can be delivered in rural areas. So we can actually demonstrate empirically that shared mobility doesn't only work in cities. It is not for those darn city slickers alone, and it is actually viable across the country. So I just like kind of leave it there. I think hopefully that's a bit of inspiration. Hopefully it give people an idea of what else can be done. Please feel free to reach out to me or ask some questions during this conference if you want to hear some more. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Julian. That was a really good start for us. And yes, sorry, I should have said that there is a bit of time for questions after each of these presentations, and also a longer panel discussion at the end before we wrap up at around 11 o'clock. So I hope we can get some good questions coming in, and feel free to use that question function to do that. I'll field as many as I can. I think I can see some appearing now, actually. There's one or two conversations about DRT, demand responsive transport, more broadly, and I'm sure we'll come on to that later with the wider panel. So I guess first off, a little bit of a challenge from one of our audience members. Often it's around the challenges of segregated cycle infrastructure, or if not segregated, at least supporting cycle infrastructure, which is often absent in a lot of these rural locations, and a real perceived safety being a real deterrent to people. I guess obviously the challenge is that this option doesn't necessarily address that. What can be done to overcome that? What are you seeing in terms of rural infrastructure provision at the moment?
I think this is such a critical question. I mean, ultimately, there are three barriers to cycling. There is cycle safety, which is number one. There is perceived competence of cycling. Despite that people say it's easy as riding a bike, people do tend to get nervous about whether they can still ride a bike. When they get on it, they find they can, but there's that mental block. And the third one is the initial cost of buying a bike. So, you know, I can fix number three pretty easily with the hire solution. I can fix number two with experience days, free rentals and things like that to get people on the bike to try. The cycle safety and the segregated cycle, it's a big challenge, and it's something where, you know, the government have committed a lot more in terms of investment, but it's still a fraction of what's needed. And I think actually, again, the reason why we should be looking at lower capital cost solutions like we're talking about here to deliver shared mobility is hopefully that then means there's more money that can be spent on cycle safety on the road. Ultimately, though, I personally don't believe it's about physically segregating every single road in the UK. I think actually it's a lot more about changing attitudes and behaviours, destroying this tribalism of us versus them, lycra versus car drivers. Nobody talks about buses and trainers. Everyone seems to talk about cyclists and drivers. But it's about getting rid of that, making these properly shared spaces. And there was the discussion about the change in the highway code. In the Netherlands, where I spent a very pleasant 10 years cycling, there was a very simple philosophy. If there was an incident between a cyclist and a car, the assumption was the car was in the wrong. It was up to the car driver to demonstrate and evidence it was actually the cyclist's fault. And to be honest, if you drive a car in Amsterdam, which I foolishly did for the first year I was there, you're like a cat in a rocking chair factory. You're petrified of the bicycles in case you accidentally nudge one with a wing mirror. So if we kind of had that more top-down philosophy that, you know, I'm sorry, car, you're not first in the pecking order anymore, because they are on the road today. Might is right. If we make them below the cyclist and below the pedestrian, I think that would really create a huge shift change in driver behaviour, and actually then have roads as a shared space. I mean, segregation is a very blunt tool. I think we need to actually change attitudes and habits.
Mm. Thanks, Julian. That's a really comprehensive response there. And just thinking about responsibilities, it's an interesting concept for Amsterdam, but specifics on this scheme, you know, how do you manage that with responsibility for theft or damage? Where does the responsibility lie for that in the scheme?
We've actually managed to, and it's a bit of a coup, actually, we've managed to secure the ability to insure the bikes against theft and loss. So at the point that someone rents the bike, there's an option to include insurance against theft and damage, and it's like 50p a day extra. So we're not talking about a big burden. So instead of £5 for a day using the Brompton, it's £5.50, and then that reduces the excess down to £100 for the end user. So, you know, just like when you hire a car now, you can reduce your excess. You can do that with this. The ultimate thing is we want to insulate the partner. So the partner has no public liability. They have no liability for the theft and loss of the bikes. When they're in that building, they're underneath our fleet insurance. When they're out on rent with the user, they're with that person.
Mm. Good. Yeah, and you've answered another question about the cost of the scheme as well there. And I assume, what about things like lights, helmets, other safety equipment? Is that included in hire? Could it be?
So in terms of lights and things, we set our Bromptons up to be what I call the every person's Brompton. So it has a telescopic seat post, so it can take someone from 4'1" to 6'8". I know it's 6'8" because that's the size of our CEO. But it has always on dynamo lights as well, so people don't have to think about switching them on off. The one thing we don't do is include helmets as standard. What we do, however, when we're doing these virtual locations, is we provide the operator with the option to have a few helmets there, which if someone would like to take a helmet as well, they can. Of course, we know from experience from our Antipodean cousins that if you mandate helmets, you've halved the number of people who cycle. So we're not in a position of mandating cyclists helmets, but we do recommend people use the appropriate safety equipment for the conditions they're cycling in.
Okay, that's good to know. Good to know. There's some really good questions coming in, a lot about around the integration with other modes and also the sort of interaction and prioritization of different modes. I think we'll return to some of those in the panel discussion later on, but perhaps a couple more questions quickly for you, Julian, before we move on. One is about utility. You know, a lot of it's around leisure cycling or sort of specific modes. Is there any consideration of cargo bikes or alternative bikes that might become part of your system in the longer term?
The short answer, actually, surprisingly, is yes. We had, I mean, Brompton Bike Hire, for those that don't know, was actually set up as a purpose-led organisation, and we have a very complicated mission statement, but I break it down into 3 words, which is bums on bikes. And actually, to a greater or lesser extent, we're pretty agnostic about whether it's a folding bike, a fixed frame bike, or a cargo bike. So we've already had the discussion at group board level, and in principle, as we expand this virtual hire scheme, we will start to include other bikes, or the opportunity for other bikes to be included. We're talking to one partner up in an area which I can't, I'm under NDA, so I can't say, but conceptually, we will enable the use of other bikes. It's just the only problem we have at the moment is technically, because it was set up as a Brompton hire solution, the the app only recognises one type of bike. But that's a software problem that's fixable.
Yeah, good. Oh, well, that's really interesting, and definitely scope for further discussion. I think it's probably wise that we move on at this stage, but as I said, some great questions there. We will certainly return to some of the points that haven't been covered yet in terms of partnership working and DRT. So Julian, thanks for now, but we'll see you again on the panel discussion later. Thank you very much.
Excellent. Thank you.
And I'm going to move straight over to Mandy Holden, who works for the Hope Valley Climate Action Group. Thanks, Mandy. I'll let you crack on with your presentation. We'll have some questions after. Thank you. Oh, Mandy, you're muted at the moment.
Hello.
Oh, there we go. Thank you.
Yay! Success. The constant technical glitches, and we're not even on Zoom. So yeah, just saying thanks ever so much for having me today. My name's Mandy Holden, and I am the project officer for a project called Travelling Light, which I'll say a little bit more about now. Could I take the next slide? And the next one, please, if that's okay. So I'm part of an organisation called Hope Valley Climate Action, and we're in a little slither of the Peak District National Park, just sandwiched between Sheffield and Manchester. We are a climate organisation. We're not climate scientists, we're not experts in transport in any sort of way. We're a local group trying to take practical action on climate change in the areas that are most relevant to us in the rural area of the Hope Valley. So for us, that's travel, that's looking at energy in terms of community production and demand reduction, and biodiversity and land management. So if I just move on to the next slide. So the reason for our focus on travel, and I won't need to tell anyone here, but transport remains the kind of largest emitting sector in the UK in terms of greenhouse gases. And that's only exacerbated in rural areas where you see the distance travelled being further. And in the case of kind of beautiful areas like the Peak District, we also see huge visitor numbers. In the case of the Hope Valley, between 3 and 5 million visitors a year. So even though we're not many residents, it's not negligible, it is important. And it completely makes sense as to why we have so many visitors. If you look at the first image, that's an image that I took back in April, running up on Wyn Hill with the snow still kind of capping the hills. And you can see Hope and Castleton down in the valley. It's amazing, and it's so important that to have access to this space for the people in our surrounding urban areas and cities. But the reality is that at the moment, about 85 to 90% of the journeys into the Hope Valley are taken by car. And the next image is an image of Castleton on what was a fairly murky and miserable bank holiday. But you can see the kind of that imbalance between the amazing nature we have and the way that we're accessing it. So in terms of decarbonising rural travel, we actually see this as a huge asset for us, because what we have is demand. We have millions of people visiting every year. All we need to do, and it should be really easy, is shift that mode. And that's going to provide benefits in terms of the way that we experience the landscape, and also for local people in terms of the services that are offered. So what is Travelling Light? What we're trying, oh, can I have the next slide, please? Thank you, sorry. So we're trying to do a 5-year pilot, making the Hope Valley an exemplar of sustainable rural travel nationally. So we're currently in a 9-month development stage, which is running into spring 2022. From there, we'll be into our 5-year pilot, which will be starting off with very, very kind of small gradual steps and looking at more major shifts moving towards 2027. The idea being that if we can test and trial and experiment with things here in the Hope Valley, we'll be able to scale that to other areas that are facing similar challenges and use that learning. So the project is coordinated by Hope Valley Climate Action, but we're working very closely with Derbyshire County Council, who are our Transport Authority, and the Peak District National Park Authority, who are our Planning Authority. And our current funding for the development stage is coming from the Foundation for Integrated Transport. So the things that are quite radical about what we're doing is we're trying to coordinate something from the community. We don't know quite how that's going to look and feel, but we're having a go. And also that we see that in terms of rural travel, there really is no single solution. What we need to see is a package of measures which are integrated and are cross-cutting. So yeah, it's about safe walking and cycling and including as many people as we can in that, not just your kind of lycra-clad folks. High quality seamless public transport and the limited use of electric vehicles, many of them shared. Can I grab the next slide, please? So in terms of a dream, we see out of decarbonising travel a huge amount of co-benefits, particularly that everyone can experience the joy of the Hope Valley without the need to own a private vehicle. It's potentially a huge marketing opportunity for visitors to come specifically because they can explore the landscape in a way that fits in with their sustainable values. And we're really inspired by projects in Europe, like the Alpine Pearls project, which do exactly this and have those kind of ideas like to respect nature and spend their holiday with nature, not against it, which is one of my favourite quotes and inspirations. So we have very low car ownership levels in Manchester, and about 1/3 of households not having them in Sheffield, which are where a lot of our visitors come from. So we see it as an opportunity for more low-income households to be able to access nature in a way that doesn't create those conflicts with congestion, with antisocial parking, with speeding. And we know from a lot of talking to a lot of our local young people that they are actually turning down job opportunities because the transport options to get them there aren't there. So those are a few of the co-benefits. Can I grab the next slide again, please? So in terms of what we see that as looking like in the future, we're very lucky in the Hope Valley that we do have a train line running through between Manchester and Sheffield. So you grab a train in Manchester or Sheffield, it carries your bike easily, your equipment for climbing, your luggage, maybe a folding Brompton or two, and you could arrive into a mobility hub, use that same ticket to connect on, exactly as Julian was saying, to a bus that would take you maybe to Buxton or to Bradwell, to those places that aren't on our train line, grabbing a shuttle to take you off to a fell race, to one of the caverns, to the reservoirs that surround us, or perhaps jumping in a taxi to take you off up some winding road to a really secluded hotel for a beautiful day out there. We also see that you'd be able to use that ticket to grab bike hire or e-bike hire. So absolutely kind of shout out to Julian to say that if you are looking for a location to trial your Brompton scheme, bear us in mind in terms of the Hope Valley. And yeah, just to echo as well, that safety thing comes back time and time again in terms of cycling. So we really like to see the introduction of kind of true quiet lanes where those connections can be made in terms of roads where cycling and walking has priority, and the option for looking at restrictions to create some roads which are car free. And that shift as well towards shared electric vehicles and the platforms that will support that shift away from the notion of private ownership more towards a kind of utility-based approach to cars. And we see what's really key is all of those things knitting together. That's the focus for us. So can I grab the next slide again, please? So what can HVCA do? First thing to say is that we know that this is ambitious, and some people will say that we're completely mad, but we feel like in the current climate situation that we're in, we absolutely need to be. And what we're doing at the moment is iterating a lot and working out like what does this feel like from the perspective of a community group, and that's part of the learning and part of the journey to see how that works. But what we can absolutely do is forge new partnerships by creating opportunities for people to test and share and collaborate. And we're doing a huge amount of that as part of the development process, bringing together recreational groups, people from the visitor economy, transport operators, travel map planners from all across the region, Manchester, Sheffield, Derbyshire, and kind of getting them talking. We can grow momentum and energy for change. We're really embedded here. We live here, you know, and that's in terms of talking to people and getting support. As a community organisation, we feel like we have a lot to offer in terms of that. So in terms of preparing and evaluating the case for new ideas so that the Hope Valley is ready to mobilise when those pots of funding come available, we want to instigate our own pilot projects so we can trial and investigate and incubate those new forms of sustainable rural travel. And we also think that we can generate additional resources for project delivery. We have charitable status, so what we can do is really complement the work of bodies like Derbyshire County Council and support them in what they're doing. So a lot of my work at the moment is around looking for funding for the implementation stage. So we think that what we need is 2 full-time equivalent members of staff who are coordinating the implementation and the ongoing community engagement, running those community level pilot projects, and really critically dealing with monitoring and evaluation, because as much as we want to see change in the Hope Valley, what we really want to do is learn from what we're testing and trialing here so that we can scale that to other areas. That's where we're really going to see the impact in terms of climate. So thanks very much for inviting me today. It's an absolute privilege to be part of the panel. That's me for now. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Mandy. Thank you for that. And again, thanks to those that have asked some questions as well. We've got a couple of minutes now just to cover things off. And I think what's come up a lot in some of the comments is again on this partnership working. So I just wondered if you could say a bit more about where you think you've got opportunities for partnership working, where you're seeing those partnerships develop with local businesses or other organisations.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think one of the main things that we're looking at the moment is this idea of cross-boundary working, because we are in a position where most of the people that come to visit the Hope Valley actually come from outside the Hope Valley, from Sheffield and Manchester and the wider region. So we're trying to build those ties with mayoral authorities and try and draw all that together. So that's really key. And yeah, absolutely. In terms of building links to businesses, connecting with all the travel operators in the region, bike hire, all of those sorts of things. It is all about partnership working and bringing those people around the table who wouldn't necessarily talk to each other for that kind of cross-pollination of ideas. I feel like that's something that's really key to our approach.
Yeah, that sounds really promising, and certainly some suggestions from our audience members here about, I guess, learnings from other national parks, but also somebody was suggesting whether maybe hotels and B&Bs might offer a discount to people that use buses to get into the valley. Are those the kind of ideas you're looking at?
Yeah, absolutely they are, and that's why we're trying to work so closely with those businesses, with those hotels, pubs, restaurants, and get them on board, because it's through those places which connect directly with the people who are visiting that we're going to see some momentum grow around this, I think.
Yeah. And something a bit more tricky though, you've talked a lot about the positive side, the carrots, the encouragement of the sustainable modes and that sort of thing. Have you considered more of the sort of the sticks end of things that you might do to limit or try and prevent car access? What have you got in mind there?
Absolutely. So I think inevitably that is going to be part of it, but it's about kind of how you work those things in and how you introduce them and how you build support for them. So like one thing that we're looking at doing and we're trying to work towards into the spring of next year is trying a few kind of car-free Sundays on a few of the back roads which don't have businesses businesses on them. They're just purely getting out into recreational areas to try and get more people feeling comfortable, but just to try those for a few Sundays and see how it works, see what issues there are in terms of displacement and how we can manage those, see what shuttles need to be incorporated, and really try it as an iterative process, because I think inevitably there will need to be restrictions, but it's about really understanding how those things work, and seeing what benefits in terms of the kind of peaceful, tranquil, enjoyable experience we can bring alongside those things.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's where the monitoring and evaluation comes in, you know, and that those pilots being able to sort of trial things. But yeah, what's the reaction been like so far? Have you had any negative responses from public, from locals, and what have you responded?
I think mostly, skepticism, I think is the thing, that rather than negativity, people see the climate emergency, they see the impact that the amount of cars that we have at the moment is having on the landscape. They see that, but they possibly are not as optimistic about it as we are about seeing change. But we feel like you have to be optimistic and give it a go, don't you?
That's it. No change is ever easy to come by, but it's a good positive note to finish on for now. I think there's been some good suggestions here, and some other discussions we might need to pick up on around bus deregulation and you know, the benefits that you've got from having rail lines in other areas that don't necessarily have them. But I think we'll return to those in the panel discussion. I'd like to make sure that we get time for the other speakers as well. So thank you, Mandy, for now, and we'll see you again in the panel.
Thank you.
I'd like to move straight on to Jennifer's discussion, which is really interesting around what they've been doing on urban design. So Jennifer, please carry on. I'll join you for some questions afterwards.
Thank you, Katie. I think I can be heard. Yeah. So my name is Jennifer Ross. As you saw, I'm a planner, founding director of Tybalt's Planning and Urban Design. But what I'm going to talk to you today is about an initiative which lots of you may have heard me talk about before, or members of our team, our Velo City proposition, which is about it's a comprehensive sort of planning thing about rural communities, particularly in Oxfordshire. If I could have the next slide. And I think this quote from John Monbiot sums up the philosophy of our strategy. The biggest problem in the world is isolation, disconnected socially and physically. And I hope when I've talked through this, you'll see where our strategy came from. Next slide. So in 2017, we decided to enter a national infrastructure competition launched by the NIC about the Oxford to Cambridge rail link, and how best they could take advantage of that rail link in building a sustainable transport and encouraging, you know, 1 million new homes within the area. And we began as our little team to cycle around the area, and we decided that what we wanted to concentrate on was rural communities. When we went round, though, there was lots of strategies about, could you expand Milton Keynes, could you build new towns? And when we actually went around, we thought, actually, there's hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of little villages, and they're the special character and the special quality there. And what we wanted to do was concentrate on a strategy that would look at linking villages and taking advantage of particular stations. And why this is zooming in was the particular station we looked at was the station of Winslow. Next slide, please. Julian will be pleased with this. This is our little gang. I wasn't on my Brompton that day when this picture was done, but all the rest of my gang was. We're a team of building professionals from, and you'll see all women as well. We all met cycling, long distance cycling, and talking about regeneration, talking about what we'd like to do in life. So when this competition came up, it was absolutely perfect. So that's us, 6 of us. We're engineers, we're architects, we're urbanists, we're planners, and you know, but most of all, we have a passion for cycling, and we have a passion for, you know, getting bums on bikes. Okay, next slide, please. So why the village? Why the focus on the village? You know, we were reading lots at the time about the amount of congestion, aging population. When we looked at the villages, we were looking at one very sad thing when I was cycling around and talking to the local community. The guy, one of the guys I was speaking to as I walked around, said, "Oh, you know, there's no young people in our village anymore, and you know, the schools have closed and things like that. You know, things like that. You know, so the amount of the obesity problem we have, the dependency on cars, all things we know, people being priced out of rural villages and increasing social isolation. It comes back to that original quote. And those are the sort of things that we read about and read around about. And so those are the sort of things we want to tackle. Next slide, please. So what is it? It's a spatial proposition, and it's a spatial proposition that tackles everything from the large scale to the, you know, the minutiae of how you introduce new housing into villages. And this is it in very conceptual terms, looking at clusters of villages. When you, I mean, I as a planner, when you sort of see how local authorities and planners evaluate whether we should allow villages in the rural communities to develop, you sort of see these sort of like long charts of how unsustainable they are, and then a cross of where we don't put development, and you know, we'll never allow development in villages. And they do it on a village by village by village by village, and it leads you to a very simple conclusion: oh, we've got to put new housing on in towns, we've got to put them on edge of our larger settlements. And what happens then is you get smaller settlements growing and growing and growing with these horrible little attritions on the edge of expanding towns, and villages are just dismissed and they're not allowed to grow and they're held in aspect. But what about if we start to think about the village cluster, groupings of villages? And this is the diagram on your left, is a diagram of the Winslow station and the number of villages that sit around that Winslow station. As you can see, there's quite a lot of them. They're all only about 2 miles apart. They've already all got the road infrastructure in place. They're all pretty connected to Winslow Station there. And if you actually thought about that as a cluster, a symbiotic cluster, villages in a garden, if you like, rather than a garden village, you know, and you can start to sort of see groupings of village, you start to get to critical mass and start to think of them in a more holistic way. And you can start to build a much more sustainable proposition when you think about those groupings of villages. Then you go down to the next, the village cluster scale, and I'll come into this in a minute about how you can actually think about an integrated transport system, starting with at the top, the fast movement, the station, moving to the car and reallocating road space, and how you move the cars out of that village cluster, which then creates the very thing that Julian was talking about, how you create safe networks of routes and linkages, utilizing the countryside to allow very direct alternative types of mode of transport in terms of the bike, etc., and good bicycle links. Nothing at the cost of what a new road would cost, but all you're doing is reallocating space and reallocating and reorganizing the transport modes of from the station to the car to the delivery vehicle to the right down to the walking and the pedestrian. Then you look at the village itself and the challenge that we've got in terms of introducing new housing into villages in a good way, you know, and we've done a lot of work around, you know, design and how villages can grow and the sort of facilities they need. So it's a holistic strategy, thinking of the big scale of cluster moving down into the village. Can I have the next slide, please? So what is it? As I said to you, it's a very, the Velo City, our proposition is a very, we should have called it Velo Village, but, you know, Velo City sounded better, but, you know, it's sort of Velo City is about this holistic, integrated strategy that has a number of facets to it. People over cars, shifting the emphasis and putting the bicycle and the person and walking first, and creating new movement networks and new movement. I mean, one of the things that struck us was when you ever look at transport, I mean, none of us are transport planners, which was probably quite helpful. And, you know, this sort of, you're always thinking about the travel to work, you know, and how to get people to work as fast as they possibly can. And actually, when you actually look at the amount of movement within each village, you know, what people are doing, and particularly, you know, again, it comes back to women. They take the kid to school, they then go shopping, they then come home, they then go and see a friend, or there's multiple things that people do, and all short journeys. There's the less than 5 mile journey, and actually the bigger journey to work is also the sort of longest journey, where you can actually utilize different, the sort of faster networks. But actually what you want to do is think about all the journeys, and think about putting opportunities in for those shorter journeys to be done within this village clustered. I talked about this connected, not isolated, linking villages with shared resources benefit everyone. I'll come back to that in a minute. Compact, not sprawl, making villages compact, thinking about that village and gardens concept again. Resilient, not fragile. Now, this is one of the most important things, promoting a sustainable environment and health and well-being, and I'll come back to that in a second. And opportunity over decline. Now, this is my big one, and it's actually releasing land in villages to enable new development to happen, and for villages to grow, and to grow in a sustainable fashion, because that's been part of the problem. It's all very well putting in bus links, but if there's no people to use it, and not the critical mass to use it, and to get people on that transport, it's not going to work. Next slide, please. So I'm going to talk about this in a little bit more detail, and this kind of links with what both of the previous speakers have said. So this is the diagram of Winslow. You can see Winslow at the top as the station. That's the fast link to the Oxford and Cambridge corridor, and that's your sort of starting point, and sort of like where you move to the system. And then within that system, the strategy has, as people have talked on the thing, transport hubs at the station, delivery hubs at the station, transport hubs in each of the villages. The next layer is to think about the car, and how the car moves, and what sorts of car, what is through movement, where do people actually want to travel, and try and get the car out of this village cluster system onto the main road. And on the diagram, you can see a car system. What we did was sort of look at all the movement network within each village cluster, and said, well, actually, there's a lot of through traffic, and there's a lot of movement between villages, but people don't actually need to do that. What they need to do is get out of the village onto the faster movement networks, which will allow us the opportunity to reorganize and replan the internal car movement network, and allow us to free up some roads to use as movement corridors for bicycles, and also utilizing the green spaces that sit between sit at the center of these villages. That space in the middle of this cluster is a space the size of Richmond Park, and actually what we did was take a lot of the movement public rights of way through here, and create fast cycle networks between each of the villages, which were safe networks and off the road, but utilise roads as well as part of this overall strategy of reorganising space. As you can see, we have got a link, a transport movement link connecting each village, which is diagrammatic, this circular here, but that's for delivery vehicles, potentially disabled people, when you do have to move within the system. But we've reorganized the whole transport movement around that cluster to enable the cycle and the pedestrian to move through it, linked with transport hubs, linked with delivery service hubs, which so it's a whole integrated system that actually links all of these things together. So it allows you to move on the fast networks, but within your village cluster to move on the slow networks safely. Next slide. And this is critical to it as well, and it comes back to this point I said earlier about village clusters. If you think of the cluster and not just village by village, you can then start to think, well, one of the village supports the library, one of the village supports the village school, one of the village supports the food, the medical thing. So each village is doing something that contributes to the overall whole, which then allows that whole system to become a little bit more sustainable, and to support the sort of facilities that serve the individual cluster. And then obviously you've got the higher order clusters in Winslow, which is a higher order services, and then you've got Oxford and Cambridge if you want to go there in the higher order system. So you've got a whole system that is self-supporting and thinking how it works through that system. Then you've got actually the densification of villages and integrating things like the church, the the shop and things. And the thing that's come out very much, and this was we did this pre-COVID, but and some of the things which I'll talk about later is sort of work hubs related to transport hubs, so that people can come and actually work part of the week within smaller work hubs, and something which I will come on later. We're working with Blenheim, and so using the work hubs 3 or 4 days a week and potentially going to the higher order centre to work in other parts of the day. So the villages becomes this much more living system within which you shop, you do your everyday things and go to higher order things down the line. And we did a lot of work about how we integrate some of these bigger uses within existing villages. So sort of shared resources and diversification is it in its essence. Next slide, please. And the other thing which I started was saying, our landscape as we see it is not the landscape that was many years ago. And we were very struck by, as I said to you earlier, that the green spaces at the heart of these villages, in the centre, size of well, for me, I had to sort of get a scale reference, but and I was thinking, oh, size of Richmond Park, that's huge. That landscape can be used in a much more positive fashion in terms of a productive landscape, that the open space, the access to nature, and a much more active landscape in terms of the connectivity. So it becomes a much more usable resource for the sort of community within the central area. Next slide, please. And again, a big part of this, and this was Expedition's part of this, was promoting sustainability and small energy networks, and sort of the drainage networks, and putting in sort of things that would allow the village to become much more resilient, the cluster village much more resilient and sustainable in the networks that we put in, which was absolutely crucial to that holistic overall strategy that we did. Next slide, please. The big thing for us was, and it comes up, and particularly as a sort of planner working, is people resistance to introducing new development in village. And we spent a lot of time on, what does good development look like? And we deliberately this is adapting a sort of Constable painting here, and sort of thinking about actually how can we get support for development within villages, and thinking about development within. And we did an awful lot of research in the architectural team of densification and what is good densification. And a lot of it comes down to, when you plan out roads and you think about how you deliver housing in a slightly different way, how you can get denser development, and you can do a different sort of delivery housing model, and shift the emphasis to green space, shift the emphasis to walking and cycling, and start to plan out the car and think about things in a very different way. So that was a critical part of our strategy. Next slide, please. And the critical thing was this, and then this is quite an important point what we are talking about is releasing land in villages which has never been allocated for development before. And you can do it in there was part of the plan was a lot of design codes, but part of it was, well, this land is agricultural value right now. If we start releasing it, it's a great privilege to release that land and allocate it. Therefore, the money that comes out of that release of land should not just go to the developer, but should come back into the village, and do the things like putting in the cycle routes. So it's a land value capture type thing, but it should be very upfront. And the local authorities on the front foot doing this and saying, yes, you can build in villages. Yes, we can release land, but that's got to be recycled. It's got to pay for the infrastructure. It's got to pay for the strategy as part of the cluster. So a sort of like, if you allow this to happen, it pays for things that are proactive, and it recycles into the communities, but it also it allows us for delivering a lot of the infrastructure things I've been talking about. Next slide. And this comes back to this, leads on to this point about everyone having skin in the game that lives there, and the sort of everyone benefiting, everyone understanding that actually, if this happens, it benefits us all. And, you know, the sort of, whether it be from the local builder and the supply chains who says, you know, I got to work in this, and, you know, and that was supported by training, the pensioner who moves into the village and, you know, it's sort of one, and you know, it's close to the GP surgery, the counsellor, the farmer, everyone has a skin in the game, and it is actually something that is benefit to everyone in a very holistic way. Okay, next slide. And that's the sort of vision of it, and there was a lot of that in the competition. Next slide. So that was a long time ago. Well, it's 4 years ago. We then built on it because we got a lot of good support. We've won a lot more awards. We've been presenting to government groups. We actually went and saw Brompton, and so if you can see it there in the right hand corner, and talked to them about it. So, you know, how could they actually develop it? We've been exhibiting, entered a lot of other competition, but ultimately what we wanted was a client, a real client that we could do something with. And we always thought that this is actually something that, who are the people that take the really long-term view on things? And we thought that it is actually a landed estate, and we spoke to quite a lot, and we actually got a commission with Blenheim Estate in Oxfordshire, which was brilliant because it was right in our corridor. And next slide, please. And we've been working with them for 3 years, and you can see there, the pink is the amount of land they own, and they do take an enormous, they take a 500-year view on life. You know, they see themselves only as the custodians of land and the custodians of their environment and the custodians of the future to hand down to generations. So that's a perfect client in a way, and they own a lot of land. And you can see there that, you know, there are 8 villages. You can see right in the middle there, the Blenheim itself. And so next slide. The vision was very much, as you saw in that original diagram, a cluster of village, not standalone developments, identifying a scope for connected development across new villages and across the Blenheim estate. That was one of the quite critical thing. Investment in high quality infrastructure that connects the stations, notably Longhamborough and Oxford. And, you know, one of the things we're working with them is the growing villages and new villages and putting in workspaces and, you know, looking at that local economy and using the big back garden idea that I told you earlier and integrating this whole strategy into the park and ride network, the long distance bus networks, and thinking about this holistic transport thing in a way that I was talking about earlier. Next slide, please. Also critical to it has been integrating it into planning and the idea of the sort of overall integrated living and working connectivity and climate, and aligning it with Oxfordshire County Council's strategy. And this is the sort of diagram that aligns it to planning policy and allows it to all the initiatives and the transport initiatives, the growth initiatives, and sort of making sure that what Blenheim want to do aligns with all of those strategies that are coming out from local authorities. And that's what we're working on at the moment. Next one. And this is a sort of long-term vision of that strategy. And you can see how that manifests itself in the diagram, which is the villages and the village growth. What we've done is sort of like move traffic and road infrastructure and through traffic into the wider network that sits outside of that network onto the main corridors, which has allowed us to release road networks to allow pedestrian links and cycle networks, utilizing the park in a lot of this strategy, building the sort of appropriate infrastructure in each of the villages, releasing land for new homes, a lot of community support, and, you know, changing the planning regime. Now this is from 2030 onwards. We've got a long way to go. We're in sort of year 1 and 2, and some of the initial work has been opening up some new networks through the park to connect stations and building that capacity towards this ultimate goal. And that's really what I wanted to talk to you about, taking a small idea that we did in a competition, and we're now seeing it realized. And I'm really encouraged by the earlier speakers that some of those initiatives I can see locking into that sort of stuff. And, you know, what is a very idealistic sort of holistic strategy, I hope will start to sort of move into planning for real. Thanks very much for listening, everyone. That's it.
Thank you, Jennifer. Thank you. I mean, it is really fantastic to see that the way that you've communicated that vision, particularly these sort of the visuals, I think is really compelling. I'm really pleased to see that it's also, you've got as you say, a real life project to sort of develop that in as well. Given the time, I think we'll shift straight on to the final presentation that we've got. There are some comments and questions that Jennifer, hopefully we can pick up in the panel discussion. But if I could move on to Neil now, and he'll just have a few concluding points to make, and then we'll have some time for panel. Thanks very much, Neil.
Thanks very much. Yes, the pedals of going last mean that my thunder has been well and truly stolen by the three previous speakers, so I'm going to go through this reasonably quickly, and then I think we can get on to the panel discussion. How green can we make our valleys and other rural areas by using public transport? That was basically the challenge that I set myself. Next slide. Julian's already shown a version of this graph, but this disaggregates the information just a little bit more in terms of the different types of settlement that we have around the country. And you can see there that urban with significant rural and largely or mainly rural areas have been declining quite significantly from a high midway through the last decade. They've been declining quite significantly, and in fact the only category of settlement that has been declining even faster in terms of its use of buses has been in fact big metropolitan city areas. So the bus has been under a huge amount of pressure in terms of being the linchpin of urban and rural mobility, but in particular rural mobility. Next slide. As a random example, I drilled down into some information for the east of England, and I picked out the counties, the areas which are probably most rural within the east of England. And there are some interesting stats within that. Two of those more rural counties, Suffolk and Cambridgeshire, again exhibiting that continued decline in terms of people making use of the bus for their rural mobility. But Norfolk, to a certain extent, bucking the trend there and being able to actually keep a reasonably consistent level of use of the bus, despite the rural nature of that county, for those of you who know it. And it might be interesting as part of the panel discussion to think about what they might be doing differently in Norfolk, or what might be different about Norfolk, and how we might apply that model more widely. Next slide. I'm not going to go through these in a huge amount of detail. They're the sorts of maps that many of us will have pored over throughout our transport planning career. This is accessibility to hospitals on a weekday morning, on the left-hand side by public transport, and on the right-hand side by bicycle. I was wondering whether the solution to rural mobility might be the bicycle, and Julian's given some thoughts already on that. But you can see that huge parts of this is the southeast of Scotland, huge parts of the southeast of Scotland not accessible by public transport weekday mornings, and despite the fact that most of those places will have roads that you could ride a bike along if you wanted to, also not accessible by a bike ride of less than 30 minutes. So clearly a significant problem. Next slide. Big problem in terms of evening travel. Quite often rural areas will have reasonable levels of accessibility by public transport during the day and during the week, but evenings become a completely different matter. And in particular, some challenges in terms of being able to, for example, get to your destination in the evening, but not actually able to get back home again. And clearly, if you can't make a round trip, you aren't going to make that by public transport. Next slide. And finally, a similar one to the map that we started with. How can you get to your GP surgery by public transport, or again by bicycle? Again, huge parts of southeast Scotland not accessible to a GP surgery by public transport. much better when you factor in the availability of using a bike, but still often requiring some really significant distances to be cycled. And I think we need to challenge ourselves as to whether we can realistically expect huge parts of the population to make use of bikes for those kind of journeys. Next slide. We did some work for the local government association about how to make bus services more attractive across England. I'm not going to go through all of these points in detail, but this is a summary of where we got to in terms of the research that we did. I think we concluded that the building blocks are generally well known, but often really constrained by funding. We know what makes a good public transport service attractive to users, but in rural areas where we don't have that critical mass, as the previous speakers have spoken about, then that isn't going to be a commercial proposition, and we need to think about how that might be funded going forward. There's a lot of talk about demand responsive transport as an option, but in its most recent incarnation and in its most flexible and useful form, it's still very much an innovative edge case, and educating people about how to make use of demand responsive transport is often a challenge, and we really recommend that it's not really seen as a universal panacea. It's very easy to take one of those maps that we looked at previously and just colour in the grey areas and say that that will be covered by a DRT service. Lots of challenges associated with that, which I can come back to in terms of the panel discussion later on. And really just picking up on the point that Jennifer's made, and I think the conclusion that I'm starting to come to as a transport planner, I don't think we can make any of this work properly without enlightened wider planning decisions. We have to make sure that we create a critical mass for public transport if we're going to expect people to use public transport in rural areas. So that's about developing livable neighbourhoods to reduce the need for car travel, making sure that new developments have thought about how public transport will access and permeate through them, and indeed thinking about how to restrict car access and make car use less attractive, even in rural areas. Next slide. So what is the solution for rural mobility, and is there actually one? Many areas will have a rail or a bus solution. Mandy talked to us a little bit about the situation in the Hope Valley, and again we could come back to that in terms of the discussion that we're coming into now. Is DRT really a suitable solution, and how do we make that an attractive and viable solution for large numbers of people? We often talk about community transport solutions, and that's great if you've got an enlightened and empowered and a good pool of people to get involved with community transport. But if we start to see that as the only solution, then we start to stretch those volunteer resources really, really thinly. We've not talked very much about car sharing and car clubs, but clearly that could be a perhaps more viable alternative to a conventional village bus service. Julian talked a little bit about cycling, and we touched in the course of that discussion on e-bikes. Clearly an e-bike would extend the range that we looked at on the previous maps, the range that people could cycle to access a GP surgery or some other facility that they need to get access to. So we need to think about how we might factor e-bikes into a rural mobility solution. And clearly people can walk, and we need to think about how that fits in. I do wonder, and it will be interesting to take this into the panel discussion, I think, I do wonder whether actually perhaps we are stuck with the car in certain parts of the rural country, and therefore how do we make car travel as green as we possibly can do. And there is starting to be some discussion about how we join up all of these potential rural mobility solutions through mobility as a service. I think often many of us saw mobility as a service as a urban transport solution, but perhaps we're now starting to move to a situation where perhaps actually the more interesting applications of it are in rural areas. We're joining up a whole disparate range of different mobility solutions in one single app and in one single place might well be the way that we get people out of their cars and ensure that we aren't stuck with the car. So I think all of those things will contribute to making travel in valleys and other rural parts as green as we possibly can do, given the particular challenges that that we face in terms of providing attractive mobility solutions. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much. Thank you, Neil. Yeah, I think it's time to invite the other panelists to join us now for a bit of discussion. Neil's prompted a couple of points that no doubt we'd like to cover, and I'll try and pick up some of the others that haven't necessarily been covered in detail from the audience. If there are other questions, let me know. We've probably got about 20 minutes or so to cover some issues. So thanks everybody for joining me. I think I'd like to kick off a little bit on the sort of the planning system. There's been quite a lot of discussion about integration and the ability to sort of make progress in some of these, the way that we plan and implement these things. I've seen some comments in the discussion here about regional transport authorities. Is it time to return to a regional level of planning? Or where is the I guess where is the impetus and who are the drivers of this? I mean, Jennifer, perhaps you could speak a bit more about your experience of working with planning authorities at different levels, and what's most effective for implementation here.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're absolutely right, and I think it's been hinted on what everyone has said. I think it's integrated planning. I think it is regional, it is area planning, and it is holistic planning. It's actually to get a grip on rural areas and to realize that, you know, we can't hold the countryside in aspect, and I think it's wrong to do so. And if we do take this holistic approach, this joined up approach, we can actually solve the problems. And it, you know, is about allocation of housing, it is about integrated systems, you know, thinking, you know, the train operator thinking with the highways, thinking with the planners, thinking with the environment agency. It's everything, and it is joined up thinking, and it's right at the it is to plan. And I think a lot of local authorities, we've done quite a lot of work actually in, you know, sort of thinking 2050. I mean, that one that I talked about on the Oxfordshire thing, that's 2050, and they are wanting to think holistically from the beginning, right the way through all the things I was talking about. I don't think we can't think in silos to solve this problem anymore, and planning should come to the fore and, you know, solve this. We can't be on the back foot just relying on, you know, house developers saying, oh, I'd like to put my development there, please, and then justifying it. It's put planning on the front foot and everyone around the table, if I may be so bold.
Fantastic. Any other panelists like to add to that, or sort of point to good experiences of that kind of integrated planning? That's there you go.
There you go. I think, no, I honestly do think it is changing. I mean, we are getting a lot of approaches to Velocity and a lot of thinking around, and that joined up thinking, and a lot people are having to go, I'm going to have to think strategically. I can't, you know, so I don't think it isn't happening. I think we're all slowly coming out of this COVID thing, and we are actually all thinking differently. I mean, I don't think it, you know, as Neil was just saying, I'm coming to the conclusion, and I think a lot of people are. So don't think it's not happening. I think it is happening.
Yeah, I didn't want to jump in just because I really agree. Like, for us, everything that we're doing is all about being connected. And as much as we're the Hope Valley, a lot of our community is Sheffield based, is Manchester based, is in the much wider region. And if we don't look at it like that, it feels like there's no chance. And yeah, I think that is starting to happen.
I completely echo all of that. I mean, I would say 75% plus of the projects I'm working on now are cross-modal, often working with multiple different transport solutions, looking at kind of trying to be intelligent in terms of positioning of hubs, But also, I mean, I spend a lot of time talking to developers and actually getting developers to start to think, not start with the car, end with the car. The car is the last thing in the hierarchy. And to be fair, and that's not a word you often use when talking about property developers, they are starting to get it, and they are actually starting to see the benefits for them as well.
Fantastic. Well, that's encouraging, and I think I just want to dwell on that integration a little bit more, because we talked about modal integration in particular. A lot of that comes into interoperable tickets and that sort of stuff. Julian, I think you've got experience of mobility as a service projects, particularly high trans as working quite well. So yeah, how is that working? What's the magic ingredient there?
Wow. Okay. I've got the magic ingredient, the magic bullet, the thing we all seek for. So we've been involved in a number of mobility hubs. Our first one was about 18 months ago now, albeit in Greenwich, in London. And we've got a lot more knowledge from that. But High Trans is launched in the last 3 months. And I think the common theme with both of them is a combination of factors. And I think factor number one is you start with a cohesive group of transport operators who kind of understand it's about getting the 86% of people out of the privately occupied car, rather than fighting over the 14% who aren't currently using it. So to understand that we work together, we build a better thing. And actually not shying away from including car share in that, because what you need to do is understand that you want people to use the most appropriate mode of transport for the journey they're taking, rather than defaulting to private car. So if you don't have a car at all, then people are going to revert back to type and go back to private car. So you need that ingredient. I think the second bit, and the thing that is really crucial, is you have a mobility as a service platform that glues it all together, makes it very convenient for the owners to use it. And that the High Trans is supported by the Velo app. And it works really well. Of course, intelligent positioning of the hubs. There's no point sticking them where they're not going to be used. So the initial group of hubs are all by mass transit, so they're all by train stations. There'll then be micro hubs going further and further out to link into it. The final one, and actually the bit that we often overlook, the most important, is having a passionate and committed public sector partner. And we have that in High Trans. And High Trans are deeply committed to pushing the envelope, trying these things, and really getting behind it and helping us facilitate it. I mean, if you look at the selection of transport available there, you've got the trains, you've got the buses, you've got DRT, you've got car share, you've got bike hire, you've got everything but gas-powered pogo sticks available at these mobility hubs, and it's all interconnected, and it's all being kind of that top-down public sector push, which is really making it happen. Because ultimately, private sector, we want to make it work, but you know, we're private businesses, so we need that kind of support from public sector to enable us to have that environment to work.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that sort of championing from the public sector to share experiences of what it's like to work from that side of things, I think is really important. I know that Juliana's shared some links in the chat function as well to the audience, so you can learn a bit more about High Trans and what they've been doing there. So, I think, given time, I'd like to move on to a slightly different topic. Please feel free to chip in if there's anything I've missed. But I think demand responsive transport has been talked about a little bit. There's been some comments as well made from the audience. I think certainly some healthy skepticism. Neil, you pointed out that it doesn't necessarily work in all areas, can't be seen as a panacea. So I guess I'm sort of asking, where does it work? What do you see the role of DRT being in rural mobility?
Yeah, if I can kick off the discussion, I'd be interested in other people's thoughts about how it then fits into the wider suite of solutions to rural mobility. I think old-fashioned, and I'm deliberately using that word, old-fashioned demand-responsive transport is probably on its way out. So the Mr. and Mrs. Jones phoning up somebody 2 days beforehand to book a bus to come and pick them up from their front door to take them shopping. If it's going to be a solution for rural mobility, it needs to be far more modern and responsive, and do what it says on the tin. It be responsive to demand as DRT than that. And we now have the capability to do that through clever back office booking systems. And as Julian's just been mentioning, we also now have the capability to start to try and integrate it more widely into other mobility solutions. The obvious first step being, how do we integrate it with conventional fixed route public transport? But beyond that, how do we make sure it's actually joined up with everything else, all the other travel options that people have? And I think one of the Achilles heels, if you like, of demand responsive transport is that it's effectively ending up being used as a sort of taxi service. In fact, the councillor described it as exactly that, a very expensive taxi service, because if you draw the demand responsive transport areas too widely and make them too big, then effectively the vehicle is monopolised by a very, very small number of people. So it doesn't matter how big you make your minibus that's picking people up. If it's busy taking Mr. and Mrs. Jones on their shopping trip for 30 miles, then it isn't available to anybody else to make any journeys. So I think if it's going to be useful, then it needs to be seen as something which in many cases can be feeding in to the wider fixed route conventional public transport system. And it needs to be doing that by making the vehicles as busy as possible, and therefore making journeys which are as short as possible to the sorts of hubs that Mandy and Julian and Jennifer have all been talking about in their presentations. So I actually think, you know, the other side of making DRT work is identifying the locations for those hubs and making sure that they've got the right facilities, so that when you step off your conventional fixed bus service and you're waiting for your DRT to take you for the last couple of miles of your journey, you're not doing that in a ditch at the side of the road by you know, what at best has a single bus stop pole, but actually, you know, it has a nice shelter and gives you some reassurance that it's a nice, safe place to wait, and hopefully actually has, you know, a wide range of other facilities as well around it.
Can I just pick up a couple of bits on that? Because I think this is really crucial, because DRT is kind of that bit that can help with people who perhaps, you know, are not willing or able to ride a bike, for example, to get that first mile, final mile in. So I think, I mean, the experience we've had across the mobility hubs, number one, the one in Greenwich, funnily enough, it's an incredibly welcoming hub. You know, they've even got a, what's it called, Wild Bean Cafe, which gives you that kind of, like you say, there's somewhere dry and safe and warm where you can have a cup of coffee while you're waiting for the DRT to turn up. But I think what's interesting in High-Trans is because it's integrated onto a mobility and service platform, it does that journey planning and it optimizes it. And because it's sponsored by a local authority, it's making sure it's providing the best holistic journeys for the whole community, not the best journey for Mr. and Mrs. Jones necessarily. So Mr. and Mrs. Jones may end up spending an extra 2 minutes on their journey, but overall everyone's getting a better experience. And I think that's really crucial. It's who owns the prioritization in the MaaS. And if it's purely aimed at the end user, well, it's going to end up putting everyone in Ubers, isn't it? Because that's going to be the quickest and the most convenient route for them. But actually we want a kind of holistic view. So that's the other thing. And I think the final point to make on that, if you do it right, you get a multiplier effect. And we've seen it already in Greenwich. You're seeing that multiplier effect, that we're seeing more hires, despite the fact we are competing with DRT and car hire and car share and all that. So actually, you know, I think DRT is absolutely vital in these things, but they have to be done intelligently, just like you said, Neil, and not end up having, I mean, a joke aside, I used to live in Oslo many years ago, and I went the wrong way. So everyone else was commuting into Oslo and I was going out. I used to call it my big red limousine because I was the only person on the bus every morning heading out. And we don't want DRT to become the same thing.
Exactly. I mean, certainly do the panel feel that not just DRT, but that bus has a role in this? I think we've had quite a lot of focus on the sort of more active modes, but bus, what is it and for rural communities, and do we have the right level of prioritisation for it if it does still have a role? Don't know, Neil, whether you want to start us off on that one.
I think it definitely does, because at the end of the day, a bus is a really efficient mass transit, and mass transit in this context isn't 100 people on a bus in a city. It's, you know, it's a much smaller number of people, but all people brought together to make a common journey in the most efficient way. So yeah, of course it has a role. I think we need to focus on what bus does best. and not try and stretch it into things that it can't do. So I would start to challenge assumptions about running a bus once a day or a couple of times a week to a remote village, just to make sure that it's coloured in nicely on one of those maps that I just showed you, because I don't think that's a very efficient use of resource. So yeah, we need to concentrate on what it does well. Up until the pandemic, one of the things that bus had been doing really well was actually being a really good interurban, providing really good interurban services, and that's clearly, that clearly plays into rural mobility. So the villages, the village concept that Jennifer was showing us, the villages that are strung out along the Hope Valley, they can have a reasonable bus service. But it isn't going to be deviating off the road to go into every single nook and cranny and every single hamlet, and we need to work out how to join all of that together in the way that Julian's been talking about them doing in high trans, in a way where when someone thinks about planning that journey, they're given that holistic view. They're not given, they don't have to go on 3 different websites and 3 different apps to work out what the best way of making their journey is, because by that time they've got the keys of their car and they've driven off, haven't they?
Yeah, absolutely. And Jennifer, is there any sort of thing that you've seen in terms of prioritisation for buses, or way that that's integrating into your vision?
I come at it, from the planning way. I think my role, and very much what we looked in the Blenheim situation is whether the bus investment is going to go in the intercity, city to city, sort of connecting a key employment zone. My job within the spatial planning way was say, well, how do we get people to that bus stop? How do we get so that the long distance journeys and where all the bus investment is going to be, how do I then do all the connections on the bus, on the bike, to the transport hub? Where do we put development? Where do we put social other services so that people don't have to get on the bus to do everything? So for me, it's the spatial planning backing straight into the transport planning, and we sit together and we make sure that the whole thing is joined up, and that we are, so the person doesn't say, oh, that's just too hard, I'm going to get in my car. People actually just do think, actually, I can just ride my bike to that bus stop, and there's a hub there, and I can stop it there, and if the bus isn't there, I can have my cup of coffee in my transport hub, and it's really nice, and actually I can get my stuff delivered there but when I come home at night, and then I can drive it home to my house, or actually I can just call up. So it's all that, and all the techie stuff joining up to it. But that's it for really. It's spatial planning aligning with transport. Woo, so
Wonderful idea, definitely. And just Mandy, thinking about then like Hope Valley specifically, how does the bus sort of integrate there? And I also want to pick up looking at time, pick up a slightly different point, which is about aging population, and often that's sort of a big consideration in rural communities as well. And that's maybe perhaps where some of the does the bus come in? Does the car come in a shared way, or electric vehicles? So, Mandy, what experience have you got from Hope Valley in terms of dealing with aging population and catering for the community there?
So yeah, I'll pick up a little bit on the buses as well, and just say that we actually have really quite good buses in comparison to a lot of other rural areas, but we're not seeing the people getting on them. So I think there's a thing that we mentioned earlier about kind of restrictions and what we're going to do to get those numbers kind of back up in terms of those sorts of things. And I think in terms of the aging population, yeah, absolutely, they're a huge part of the people who rely on having these really excellent services. But there has been a drop-off in confidence after COVID, and people not necessarily coming back to them. So that's a huge argument about how we feel secure about using shared modes, which we haven't really touched on, but is going to be really important in terms of that conversation. But yeah, again, it's the same point that's been made a lot of times, but for us, it's those last couple of miles connectivity to the excellent bus services that we have, which makes them work really well for the whole population and the aging population specifically.
Yeah. Good. There's actually a very quick question we've got now, but I think what I would like to do is just see, given the time, if there are any other last comments that any of the panelists would like to make that you feel you've not been able to do so. I'll start on the order of my screen. Julian, is there anything that you'd sort of like to add as a concluding point?
I think we really must appreciate just how important it is that we need to come up with solutions for rural communities. Going all the way back to the start of my presentation, the number of times schemes have been launched and the immediate pushback is, oh, well, that's all very well and good, but it won't work in rural communities. We need to have a viable solution in rural communities. And crucially, it should be about something as simple as making sure people are using the most appropriate mode of transport for the journey they're taking. This doesn't mean getting rid of cars. It doesn't mean everyone's suddenly cycling 20 miles on a non-electric bike. So I'm going to stop there because we've got a fire alarm.
Very dramatic. Please, yeah, be safe and and leave if you need to. I'll come to Mandy then. Actually, sorry, Julian, can you come back in now? Is it a test? Okay, I'll come to Mandy and we'll come back to you. Mandy, any last comment?
Well, just to say, like, also, like, sometimes really rustic solutions are really good from like a community basis. When we're talking about demand responsive stuff, if we've got a fell race going on, let's talk to the people who are running the fell race and get them involved in getting transport out. Let's talk to the hotel that's generating the journey and those sorts of things, as well as the big technological things. And that's what we can do as a kind of a community group. Yeah.
Really important to come from both angles there, I think. Neil, anything else that you'd like to add on this?
Yeah, I guess it's been really interesting, and I've got three kind of takeaways for me. One is the integration between all the different sorts of planning. Jennifer sort of talked about it, and we've talked about it in other parts, and I think that is absolutely crucial, and a two-way dialogue, so that we're telling people, we're telling wider spatial planners as transport planners what we need, as well as understanding what they want. The second one, I think, is about geography and the scale of that geography. Mandy made the point, I think, about they're getting people in the Hope Valley and they're coming from Sheffield and Manchester and further afield, and that doesn't respect conventional, traditional sort of planning boundaries, and which are often drawn around journey to work, and maybe journey to work is actually no longer the right building block for that. An interesting discussion, I think, for later about that. And I think the third one really for me was something Julian said, which was about the need for public sector leadership, and bringing all of these disparate and often private sector people together, and not necessarily banging heads together, but actually providing that leadership. Those for me are the three takeaways, which none of which would necessarily have been top of my list before I joined the webinar today, so that was good.
Good. Yeah, educational for everybody, hopefully, and yeah, just in the last minute or so, Jennifer, anything else that you'd like to add to that?
I think I totally agree with Neil, but I think the critical thing for me and what I've found in all of this is to take communities with you. The people that are actually living in these places. And I've had a lot of kickback, I'm an old person, how do I do this? And you have to deal with that, and actually take the community with you. And the only way to do that is to give them a bit of skin in the game in this. What am I going to get out of this? So that would be my only add to point 4 to Neil's bit, I think.
Thank you. Thank you. Julian, I feel you were cut off. If there is no alarm, and you'd like to just...
It's gone. I'm not currently in flames. The only point actually I'd like to resonate with what Neil said. I actually believe we have the solutions out there already in the private sector. We have MaaS, we have mobility hubs, we have bicycles, we have DRT, we have buses, we have trains. They exist. It's not like they don't exist. What we need is strong will from the public sector, and I mean from the very top down. So this is national government and local government. If they want it, they can have it. It's there. But they need to lead. We can't.
Yeah, Yeah, absolutely. And I think that two-way conversation is really important. So thank you all for some really, really insightful presentations and discussion as well. And thanks to everyone for joining us. I bring it to a close now, but as I said, we have got COP26 upcoming, which is no doubt going to stop some interesting points of discussion. So I hope everybody can join us again after that, and we'll be reflecting on some of the emerging themes from that. But thank you all for joining us today. I've really enjoyed that discussion, and wish you all a good day. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Good morning.